Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker is a book about the world of medication and the real-life effects these medications have on individuals with mental illness. The book talked about how the use of medication has become an epidemic and broke this epidemic down to the drug use, the illness targeted, and the effects on children and adults alike. Lastly, it ended with possible solutions. I myself was diagnosed with mild depression and was prescribed 10 milligrams of Lexapro, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. After 6 weeks, my doctor and I decided it wasn't working, so we adjusted my medication to 20 milligrams. For the next 3 weeks, I suffered from terrible headaches and insomnia. My doctor reduced my prescription to 15 milligrams. This is the dosage I was on when I began to read this book. After reading the chapter called An Episodic Illness Turned Chronic, I decided that I no longer wanted to be on my medication and I wanted to recover from my mental illness on my own terms. Whitaker took several different concepts and has several main messages throughout his book. The first of these messages is the idea of new psychiatry. Whitaker noted that during the 1930s and 1940s, psychiatrists and methods such as miracle cures like insulin, coma therapy, convulsive therapy, and frontal lobotomy. In 1945, Congress passed the National Mental Health Act that allowed government to support research for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment for mental illness. The first of these new research developments was the magic bullets. This new medication was the first of its kind for psychiatric medication. They would now be called antipsychotics. The medication field exploded in 1938 with the passage of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. This law required that drug manufacturers' medication must be approved by the Food and Drug Administration as safe, not necessarily helpful. Whitaker found that in 1967, 1 in 3 adults had a prescription for a psychoactive drug and sales reached 692 million. The concern with this is that there is little evidence to support long-term effects of psychoactive drugs. Whitaker found that people who are taking antidepressants and then stop more often than not become worse. This fact is very worrisome for me. During the process of reading this book, I had stopped my medication. The book highlighted a preserved notion that mental illness is a chemical imbalance, and this is not the case, as Whitaker suggested. I was angered by the fact that we as a society are so quick to label and medicate, especially children. The chapter called Explanation of a Delusion was triggering for me. I felt myself becoming more and more angry reading that those in the field were turning a blind eye to the problem, and that due to the DSM-3, those in the field of psychology and those in the medical field now had a partnership. Medication companies are creating these medications and falsifying the results to get the FDA to pass the regulations. Then they are pushing and paying off companies and providers to prescribe their medication with no concern for the long-term effects. Patricia Elbert found that the epidemic of psychotropic medication used by older adults is overwhelming in nursing homes. She learned that many are prescribed medication to treat behavioral and psychiatric symptoms, but over the long term is known to have adverse effects. Elbert found that older adults are 7 times more likely to take these medications. Adults admitted to nursing homes are prescribed medication within 2 weeks of their admission. The usage of this prescription medication increased 20% from 2000 to 2010. Albert found that the use of these medications exhibits sedation and memory impairment, which leads to higher risk of falls and fractures. She found that these medications can affect their quality of life and can lead to fatal outcomes. In 1987, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation, OBRA, was passed, which limits the usage of this type of medication in nursing homes. The research that Patricia Elbert found aligns with the ideas of Robert Whitaker is suggesting in his book. The long-term effects can be detrimental to the livelihood of the individuals and, as Elbert suggests, leading to death. In the chapter The Epidemic Spreads to Children, Whitaker talked about the rise of attention deficit hyperdisorder, ADHD. He noted that this does not show up on the DSM until 1980, and then it spread like wildfire. The idea that a child who is fidgety and goofing off is now suffering from a mental illness. These children are prescribed methamphetamines, which block dopamine reuptake for several hours, much like cocaine. Much of the improvement from the use of this medication fell to the classroom. Children who are diagnosed with bipolar are put on multiple medications that block multiple neurotransmitters, and this treatment does not lead them to an emotional or physically healthy life. Some evidence to support those long-term effects came from Gronkowski and Morrison, who did a study on the prenatal SSRI exposure on child growth. They found that if a child is exposed in utero to SSRIs, girls of mothers who have taken these SSRIs are less likely to be overweight than their untreated counterparts. They found that with boys, there was no association with exposure and weight. They also noted that it would be beneficial to look at the patterns of growth and take into account their height and weight. Another study completed by Stein, Harvey, and Brink about the effects of prepubertal supplementation in young rats showed that major depressive disorder, MDD, is estimated to be the second leading cause of disability in 2020 and leading the way by 2030. They suggest that to fight this epidemic, there needs to be awareness, diagnosis, and treatment. They estimated that 10% of adolescents, 2.8% of children, and 0.3% of preschoolers are diagnosed with MDD. These same children have an increased risk of developing treatment-resistant depression later in life. MDD is associated with the risk of suicide and is the fourth leading cause of death in children and the second in adolescents. However, the study did find that two SSRIs, fluoxetine and escitalopram, has been effective and an approved treatment. The biggest takeaway from this research is that even the SSRIs have warnings that they increase the risk of suicidal ideations with the start of treatment. Their conclusion is that both supplementation combinations have reduced depressive behaviors, and the treatment proved to only improve early life depressive behaviors. These two articles support the findings of Whitaker that children who are exposed to long-term medications are having lifelong effects. Whitaker showed that children placed on these medications are suffering from akinesia, and the side effects are linked to suicide and violence. Lastly, the long-term effects that Whitaker is trying to pass are that they are unknown. The truth is that we don't have enough information to determine how the brain is affected by these types of medication for prolonged periods of time. Research by Lee, Humdy, Sanborn, Chai, and Dyer speak to the effects of antidepressants on balance, equilibrium, and postural reflexes, suggests that antidepressants are linked to significant skill impairment in both healthy individuals who took one dose of an antidepressant. These impairments include body sway, work performance, coordination, vehicle handling, postural control, and reaction time. These effects are obvious with antidepressants and ethanol, primarily for those that are taking a tricyclical antidepressant, TACAs. They found that these psychomotor effects remain 1 year after TCA treatment. Those taking SSRIs have no obvious impairment in functioning. A study done by Mastrodonati, Fijo, Valdez, Mesa, Luciano, and Wong talked about body weight due to antidepressants, much like Stein, Harvey, and Brink on the MDD health problem with children. MDD is a disorder that affects 121 million people. They found that in the United States, antidepressants are prescribed to 27 million people, and it is most commonly prescribed medication. Their study found that participants gained at least 7% of their body weight during treatment, the highest weight gain being marzipan, followed by the SSRIs. The conclusion to their study suggested that short-term treatment is associated with significant body size and weight gain 122 days after termination of treatment. The study by Usher and Pavel on long-term effects of depression treatment suggested that depression is persistent and long-lasting, that affects people over a lifetime. They found that antidepressants are the most common treatment, but the efficacy of treatment more than 1 year is unknown. They looked at cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, as a treatment along with the use of medication. They concluded that with regular therapy sessions and maintenance of continued antidepressant use, there is an improved in long-term outcomes for MDD. I feel that mental health has become an epidemic, much as Whitaker has suggested and proven. This epidemic can be transformed if we only take the time to look into the effects of medication that has been so freely prescribed and pushed to make the next dollar. I truly believe that one can recover from a mental health diagnosis and can have a life that's fulfilling of medication low or even free. The chapter on blueprints from reform has several suggestions for alternatives for medication. I feel that these alternatives should be widely looked at. Whitaker talked about the hunger strike and how this impacted his views on medication. He spoke about the idea that the world would have to acknowledge that a biological cause is still unknown. They would have to know that it is a medication, not a chemical imbalance, that is the problem. They would no longer be able to hide behind the lack of results of long-term studies and outcomes. All of this information helps support my choice in recovery. Not only has Whitaker given me a different light, but the supporting research on the lack of long-term medication use has convinced me that I have made the right choice. Looking at the research and the information provided by Robert Whitaker, I am left with ideas of how do I respond to a client who is asking about the causes of possible diagnosis. At first, my reaction would have been, let's find the right medication for you. Now that I have read the research in Anatomy of an Epidemic, I no longer feel that this is the correct response for their concerns. The authors of the articles in the book all have a common theme, but we truly don't know what effects to the brain or your body will have on long-term medication treatment. I feel that my answer now would be much like the Lorraine Mosher Sotira project, that getting individuals off these medications can truly improve their quality of life. Mental health recovery is real. Not only does the book and research support this idea, but I'm an example of it myself. The choice to discontinue my medication was a possible life-altering decision for me. I was on my medication for 5 months, but in those 5 months, I still developed side effects and suffered a withdrawal period. In my own practice, I would support the patient. They have the right to their autonomy and self-preservation. I feel that medication should not be pushed or forced on an individual, but should be presented as a treatment option. They need to know going into their treatment all the possible adverse side effects as well as any possible long-term effects. This will give the person a chance to make an educated choice on how they would like to proceed with their treatment. I would want to know that a life is possible without mind-altering medication and that mental health recovery is obtainable.